we're live. Hey Francis, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Great. So we're here to talk about Spectrum Street Epistemology. But before we
Mhm.
do that, if you want to tell myself and anybody who might be watching a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I am a political scientist. I have been in the university system, I guess, since the late 90s. I also did work for the government of the Northwest Territories for a few years, studying or trying to implement various policies. I was a professor at Mount Royal University from 2008 to 2021. And in 2021, I was fired for a number of different reasons having to do with criticizing what is considered to be woke, what's called woke ideas, which are identity politics that has become totalitarian. And so I had a large Twitter, what was called a Twitter war with about 20 other faculty members. And even though I was subjected to what's called an academic mobbing, where a whole group ganged up on me and tried to get me fired, I was found to have engaged in harassment and creating a toxic work environment for my interactions on social media. So as a result of that, and it's still going on, so it went through arbitration for a year, and then it's now being appealed to the labor relation. I was found to have been wrongfully terminated, but because of the fact that a number of scholar activists feel unsafe at me being at the university, the arbitrator said that he didn't think I could be reinstated. So that's being appealed to the Alberta Labor Relations Board. And as a result of my experiences trying to rationally discuss a number of issues, the most significant perhaps being indigenization of the universities, and more specifically the residential schools, the Indigenous residential schools, I became interested in street epistemology and invited Anthony Magnabosco to Mount Royal in 2020 and did a little bit of work on it then. And then starting in 2024, this year, a few months ago, actually, or maybe 6 months ago, I started to realize that this was a possible way in to the kinds of totalitarian forces that are taking over university campuses in Canada. So I've been revisiting many of the things that I was looking at in 2020 and have done a number of Spectrum Street Epistemology sessions at a number of universities in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction and telling everybody about yourself a little bit. That's really cool that you got to meet Anthony. I've been talking to him over the last several years, him, Reed. I actually worked on the street epistemology course, not the course writing itself, but I was the video example curator, so I helped with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I did. I did look at the course briefly. I haven't investigated further. I would like to, in my free time, go into that and see how it's organized and so on, and take it myself. But right now, I'm just doing it through trial and error.
Sure. Yeah, hey, that's a good way to go. Why
Yeah.
not? You learn a lot doing it through trial and error. I know I certainly did, for sure.
Yes.
Okay, so we're here to talk about Spectrum Street Epistemology. And I guess one thing that we might start off with, since you mentioned Anthony and I brought up the course, what are the differences, in your opinion, between vanilla street epistemology and spectrum street epistemology?
It seems to me that Spectrum Street Epistemology is more interested in questions of how confident you are in your belief, and then the evidence, the movement, like getting you to think about, that's what it visualizes anyway, that you think about the kinds of evidence that it would take to move you just slightly into a more disagreeable or more agreeable type of frame of mind. So when I was first looking at street epistemology, and Anthony does ask about your level of confidence. So he's doing that already in his method. But a lot of the time it would seem to be just sort of drilling down into the assumptions and not as much oriented towards people's movement from a confident position to a less confident or a more confident position.
I see. Yeah, we might take a very drastically different approach. Sometimes I do ask for confidence. That's something that I've been known to do. However, sometimes I just don't, and sometimes I don't. And I don't like never use a scale. I'll never say like on a scale from 1 to 10 or what have you. I personally find that concentrating on the confidence is less important than concentrating on the reasons for belief or assumptions or all of that good stuff. What are your thoughts on that?
I think the reasons are the most important aspect of it. So I think that is the focus always. I think it seems to me that the confidence, asking about confidence, is another way to kind of get people to think about things differently, I guess. It gives you another tool that you can deploy. And I don't know, I'm just still kind of experimenting with things. I know the visuals of Spectrum Street Epistemology with the mats, and actually Reed and Peter sent me a set of mats, which I just love. And I think that's I think that's really helpful for people to see that. And also if you've got groups, like I think you can probably more easily do things in groups with the Spectrum Street Epistemology. Because I don't know about you, for me, I have moments where I don't know how to go forward. Like you're kind of stuck. Like there's those kind of moments, and that's what I'm working on. And I really appreciate criticisms to get sort of ways to move things forward in to greater understanding. And that's one way you can kind of break it up a little bit. So if you're kind of stuck, like you don't know what the next thing it is that you should ask as to why or how people came to the beliefs that they did, the reasons and so on. If they sometimes that occurs, then you can ask them about the movement, like which way would they, how could you get them to move? And as well, when you're having more than one person, then you get them to listen to one another, then ask them whether what's been said, does that make them move in one direction or another, or are they still in the same? So it's sort of like an addition. I don't think it's the main feature, but it's kind of an additional feature to the getting at reasons.
Yeah, I think it's a very similar question, if not the same question, asking for those reasons or what would get you more confident or less confident. Yeah, I think that's a different way to ask it that can really get the wheels turning for whoever you're talking to, and hopefully able to open up. Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
Okay. I've written down here what are the best aspects of Spectrum Street Epistemology, and I think you may have mentioned it, but I'll ask anyways. Is like the getting down to the reasons, like the true underlying reasons, the most important aspect?
Well, right now in universities, so this is why I sort of re-entered into this. I've always been intrigued by it, but I hadn't really done any of it myself. And this is right now, I believe, the most important aspect of street epistemology, which is in universities right now in Canada. I'm quite interested in the difference between the United States and Canada in terms of our universities. I think Canada is recognized as being one of the worst cultural environments for universities in the world due to our I don't know why it's taken root so much, this totalitarianism, but it really is quite significant compared to many other countries. Anyway, you cannot state claims. So there's a huge degree of self-censorship that is going on, where there's these hot button issues, and it is almost impossible for people to just sort of investigate a claim without being shouted down and canceled and so on. And there's a number of issues like this. So what I find the most helpful right now at our level, at the level that we're at, is to be able to break this self-censorship and show people that you can actually state these highly contentious claims, and it can be done. And I've done it now in a number of hostile settings. University of Regina being the most obvious, because they tried to stop me from coming on campus, or they strongly suggested that I shouldn't be able to come on campus to talk about. I had been invited to give 2 talks, and what happens now is that the university says things like, "There's been all these protests when you've given talks before. This is going to be unsafe for you to do this. Therefore, we're canceling your rooms that you have." This has happened a number of times, and they can do that, or we're still trying to figure out whether they can do that or not, or whether it's protected under the Constitution. There's a couple of lawsuits that are going forward about this right now that I'm involved with. But with Spectrum Street Epistemology, you don't need a room. You could just show up. And that's what I did at the University of Regina. So I showed up at the University of Regina, and then I started involving myself in making these claims, which then had, I think, quite an interesting reaction, and enabled people to see a little bit some of the problems with the thought processes. But that's kind of the first. There's about one of my colleagues, Dr. Sinclair McRae, he's been compiling, a list of things that cannot be said at universities. And so what I want to do is take that list, and each session have one of those things that cannot be said, have that as the thing to be investigated, and then go through this whole exercise to try to examine these claims that cannot be said. So right now it is the actual stating of the claims, which is very, very important, and I think has the potential to, make a dent in the institutional censorship that's going on, which is then resulting in all sorts of self-censorship.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I think what you said earlier, I agreed with, like, really passionately about having these difficult conversations and having them, in a productive manner where they don't devolve into, these shouting, screaming, canceling, right, whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really like that, and I think we should have more of that. I don't think there should be topics that are, off limits.
Yeah.
I think that's how we grow and we learn, is having these difficult conversations, right?
Yeah, and because it's this intellectual exercise, just because you want to discuss this claim, and usually what I try to do now is I try to choose the opposite of what I actually believe. So when I'm constructing a claim, it's not what I believe, it's what my opponents believe. And so it's kind of interesting, because what you do is you're hoping to get someone who's going to argue in the affirmative, but that doesn't usually happen. So then what you have to do is you have to work on these mechanisms that Peter and Reed have done a good job with, which is, trying to get one person to argue the opposite case, or trying to get people to guess what that would be. That's what we're largely doing now, because it's really hard to get people to argue in the affirmative of the position that I've chosen, which is generally in opposition to my own position. But we get the other view not in its perfect form aired, because you can only really get the really good arguments if you have someone who truly believes it. It's just not the same, but it's the next best kind of way of going about it when you can't have the actual position being believed in.
One thing I think that has been is a really nice addition was the like guessing the other person's reason. I really like that aspect. I think it really can get people to put themselves in somebody else's shoes, and I like that. I really do like that. It might be slightly more dramatic and gamified for my particular taste, but that's really splitting hairs. I like the concept. It's very nice.
Yes, and it's really, in many of these conversations, well, at least in the Canadian context, especially when, because I've become somewhat infamous, I guess, people don't really want to be a part of a in good faith kind of interaction. So they're either there to try to defeat me, or they're there to stop me from speaking, or they don't want to have any kind of engagement about it. So if you don't have people to argue the opposite position, how does one do this, like in the ideal sense, and it's a way of at least showing, and I like it myself in that I do honestly want to try to understand fairly why people who are criticizing me believe the things that they do. I honestly do want to try to figure that out. And I would hate to think that I was sort of making up an argument that was not the most robust argument that I could think of. Now, obviously, I don't get it right, because I'm not the person who would be making the arguments, but I think I've read enough. Like, I try to read my opponent's positions. So I have some knowledge of their positions, but my opponents don't have any knowledge of my position. They have a kind of a caricatured view that is a misrepresentation of my position, generally, I find, because they think that they're approaching it ideologically, and they don't want to see it as an idea that may or may not be valid. Like, they're not approaching it that way. They're approaching it as an activist, where they want to have this imposed on everyone, regardless of whether it's true. Well, they believe it's true, but they think that the truth has been found, and their purpose is to impose this on everyone.
I think I might reframe that a little bit, and you can tell me if this is kind of what you're saying. Is it that they have this belief, and it's been tightly tied to their identity, and because of that, it's hard for them to view it in an objective sense?
Yes, it's they aren't able to abstract it from themselves. So I don't think there's any thing that you could say this idea, and I would say, oh, I can't, this is a sacred cow for me. I can't look at that. It doesn't matter how horrible the implications of that idea might be. I just see it as, this is an idea. This is what it is. Here's the reasons that I think people have for believing in this idea. Like, I tend to look at ideas that way, and I guess that's a kind of a philosophical kind of approach. Whereas I find the people who are into identity, and this is the big obstacle that we're facing, is the identity politics stuff, which is, if you criticize this idea, you are denying my humanity, because this idea is so closely wound up with who I am that you are basically by destroying this idea, you're destroying me. Like that's really, I sort of sense that I've heard similar kinds of statements being made. And my view is that we can't, if we're going to have that approach in a university, we don't have universities anymore in the sense of what we understood universities to be, which is institutions that come out of the Enlightenment tradition and are about encouraging people to use reason to try to understand why things are the way they are. That's not going to exist anymore, and it's already seriously corroded. But and we don't really see very much support for that version of the university anymore.
Sure. Would you consider yourself like a sort of like an advocate, or would you not consider yourself an advocate?
I don't know. So how would I know if I were an advocate? Like, what would be the test for me?
Sure.
So I certainly do. Like, I guess I might see myself as a free speech advocate. So that would be my advocacy if I were to put forth advocacy for the free exchange of ideas, which I guess is that's an interesting question as to whether I'm an advocate for the Enlightenment version of the university, but I see that as it's not a particular group that I'm advocating for. I'm advocating for a particular approach to the university and to what I would consider a democratic society.
Sure. I think what I mean, I can agree with, I can not agree. I think I would consider myself an advocate in the same sense. Like I'd say I'm a free speech advocate, right?
Yeah.
I think what I more so meant was, are you an advocate for any particular stance, like on any contentious issue, or would you consider yourself more of nonpartisan, I guess?
Well, I have my hypotheses. So the best example of this is my area of research. So I am a researcher of Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations. That was what I got my doctorate in, and that's what I spent, the last 20 years investigating. So I have very, very strong views on Indigenous policy. So I and they're about the nature of Indigenous culture and the importance of integration for the well-being of Indigenous people and so on. So that's a strongly held belief, which I believe is based upon significant rational argumentation and evidence. But when I'm doing Spectrum Street Epistemology, I'm trying as much as I can, and this is the difficulty, of questioning every point of view, every perspective as rigorously as any other. So in terms of why someone believes the things they do, how did they come to their beliefs? So I'm trying to be as objective as I possibly can in this role. When I go give a talk on a subject, then I will state the arguments that I'm putting forward. But in the role in street epistemology, I'm trying as hard as I can to not have my own views be obvious. Like I'm trying to
leave your views out of it.
Yeah, I would. That for me, if I didn't do that, if I was, and I can see that sometimes, right? Because, and it's almost kind of unavoidable in that if something is just like, it makes sense to you, it's like this problem of confirmation bias. You don't question it, but if something is odd and you don't believe it yourself, then it will come more easily to you to question it. But I think that's sort of the work that I'm on. Every single thing that's said, I have to make sure that I am working hard to get the person to articulate how they came to that belief, and that's explained clearly, and there's no kind of hidden questions. And actually there were two people who criticized. So I did a session on trans activism. The claim was trans rights are human rights. That was the claim. And I'm a critic of trans activism. I think that the trans is a completely subjective identity, and it has no basis in any kind of physical, anything physical. It's a subjective anyway. And so I would be arguing the position, if I were given the chance, that I don't think trans rights are human rights. Anyway, in this, I had three people that I was working with in this, and it was a very difficult environment that I was working in because it was very windy, and as well, I had written out these claims ahead of time, and then I discovered I took the wrong sheet, so I was always kind of so I was a bit off balance when I was doing this, and it was the worst session that I've presided over, because I allowed claims to go forward that should have been stopped, and we should have gone much deeper into all these things, but all these kind of very contentious points were being made, which I certainly wasn't opposed to, but they needed to be explained. Like, they were not well explained by the people. I was not getting these people to explain how they came to these views at all. And that was a bit of a wake-up call in terms of, thinking through, trying to really, I try to watch these things. Like, I try to and think to myself, how could you have done some more things here to get to a deeper kind of perspective on these things. But that one was sort of the most noticeable failure.
I have a question that might slightly be a suggestion, but I'm going to pose it as a question. It seems like many Spectrum Street Epistemology conversations revolve around observations or facts. That seems to be what is asked for or requested. Why are values rarely talked about?
I guess it's because it's hard to have an understanding of, like, that's a very complex area of philosophy where it's hard to figure out whether something is more valid or less valid. So, and it's an interesting philosophical question as to whether, how does one determine whether a set of values is a better set of values than another set of values? Like, I can say, I believe this is a better value because I believe that it would result in human flourishing more than some other value system. But then you would come up with if you wanted to drill it. So why is it that you think that there should be human flourishing, or like what basis do you pin the assumptions of which you're going to move forward? So I think those conversations are much more difficult because it's hard to know whether it has greater validity or less validity, seems to me. And you sort of feel like you're a little bit lost sometimes in these discussions as to whether they're helping us to understand things more or not, or whether they've just muddied the waters. And it's sort of like, now you come up with, one idea about the way things should be is just as good as another. Like, that's kind of a fear, is that some kind of relativist position might emerge because of the difficulties in trying to show people how this would in fact be a worse value system than another value system.
Yeah, I think those conversations are really difficult when you're comparing, value systems. I think it can be done. It's a difficult conversation. The approach that I like to take with regards to values pretty often is either I will compare values like on a value prioritization, like which value do you prioritize higher? Otherwise, what I think is even more valuable is identifying which value is at play with a particular claim. Let's you know this value is at play. This is what this person kind of wants to achieve, right? And then what strategies are they using to achieve this value? What drawbacks could be to using this strategy to achieve this, and kind of working from there. Obviously not every claim will be held up by a value. There won't be a value necessarily. Well, maybe there will be, but it might not be the most important aspect. It might be another claim or some other piece of evidence. But often, I think a lot of these claims, if they're not like a truth claim, but rather like a moralistic claim, values can be an important role to them.
So, what conversations? I'm just trying to think if I've had. I tend to be more comfortable with the factual kinds of arguments. What kinds of discussions about value? What kinds of discussions about values have you found?
Sure. I talked to a couple individuals about what was it? She identified as transgender, but we didn't actually talk about that. It was more about whether what type of sex education should be taught in grade school. And I think we determined that one of the underlying values was freedom. She wanted people to have the freedom to know the information, to determine for themselves what their best course of action in life was. So we talked about how to achieve that freedom. So what strategies can we use? And she and he stayed in their positions and determined that having sex education, like a more secular sexual education, would be the best way to achieve, for them to have that freedom, knowing all the facts about sex.
Okay. Yeah. I find that, I'm just trying to think. My own approach is about these forbidden topics. Like, that's my interest. So,
Yeah.
And maybe there's value. I guess there's probably values wound up with these. There would always be, even, sort of the value of that, claims should be based upon the best evidence available. Like, that's a value. Like, what on what basis why is that how it should be? And it shouldn't be things that make people feel good, or things that give people meaning, or but I think that it's something that I'm interested in. I'm very interested in the analysis, I guess, or the attempts to figure out validity in all these, like, because that's my interest. Because intellectually, how can we justify this way of organizing things as opposed to this other way of organizing things? And I think values are wound up with most of the, like, if not all of these kinds of discussions. It's just the difficult task of unraveling it, like trying to extract it so that it can be seen. That's kind of, I guess that's part of the skill, is to get people to be able to realize what values form the basis of many of the things that they're putting forward.
Yeah, it's something that's really difficult. When I first started to try to talk about these values, I was really, really bad at it. I didn't do a good job. Like,
Yeah.
Full disclosure, I sucked at it.
Yeah.
But as I've tried it a few more times, it's something that if I listen really closely, I can hear the values. And then I just repeat it back to him. What I'm hearing is you have this value of protection, and you really want to protect people. That's why you believe trans women should be able to use the women's bathroom because you want to protect them. I don't know what the argument might be, but and
Yeah.
then they might say, yeah, that's totally what it is. Well, why is this protecting them? How is this strategy that you're implementing, having trans women use the female bathroom? How is that protecting them? What's at play here? Like, why is
Mm.
that the strategy? What if we use a different strategy? What what would happen with that protection, right?
Mm.
So that's the conversations that's the framing I like to use. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's kind of one of those things where I can see myself getting stuck. And this is an interesting one that happened to me. Is so I went to University of Regina after I'd been canceled, and I said, "Okay, I'm coming in to do the street epistemology there." And I wasn't sure what was going to happen, whether I was going to be met with security and so on. And they were. It was all very low. And I came there. There's one security guy asking me if he could do anything for me, and what and I'm like, this is odd, because like they were telling me, we're strongly suggesting that you don't come, because anyway, I got there's this group of students that have been brought in by their professor to basically try to, I guess, tell me how I shouldn't be there. I'm not exactly sure what the plan
Hmm.
was, but they were not friendly. Anyway, one of the students, who wasn't, I don't think she was a student in the class, and she was very, very pleasant, but she was saying that what I was doing, and I was there to talk about academic freedom. That was the claim, which was that the University of Regina protects academic freedom. That was the claim. But in the backdrop was all this stuff about the residential schools, because there's a big controversy going on in Canada right now about what's called unmarked graves, and whether there was something nefarious that happened, or whether it's just graves that used to be marked and that no one knows where
Hmm.
people are actually buried. And so these two issues have become conflated: the clandestine burials and the graves that were once marked and now are in abandoned cemeteries, and no one quite knows where different bodies are buried, that sort of thing. Anyway, that was kind of the backdrop. Everyone was, accusing me of being what's called a residential school denier, which is not denying the existence of the residential schools. It's denying that the residential schools were genocidal. Anyway, I got into this conversation with this quite pleasant student, and it was very apparent that we were not communicating. We were, we were not, and it was because we had different values. So my value was truth. So that was my value. And her value was building, what she called building relationships.
Oh, I saw this one.
Yeah. So we talked, like, it was about 15 minutes. Maybe it was about, I'm not sure, but it was long. And I was watching this, and when I was watching it, I was going, what could I have done there? I was just telling her my view, and she was telling me her view. Like, that's what was,
Hmm.
I wasn't doing things that would enable her to sort of not necessarily agree with me or anything, but at least understand
Understand your perspective.
and more how it dovetailed with hers and so on. And so
Yeah.
what we came, so I was saying that in order to have a good, you can't, if you want to have a good relationship with people, then you can't lie to them. Like, lying to them causes the relationship to not be very good. And then I wasn't sure whether she agreed with that or not. Like she seemed to say it sometimes, that sometimes it's necessary to not be truthful to have a good relationship. Because at one point she said, you haven't been in very many relationships, have you? Like, that's not always the case in terms of relationships, that you're truthful in your relationships. And it's like, well, if you're discovered to not be truthful, then it causes problems generally for the relationship. I don't think there's anyone who really likes to be lied to. It's not a thing that they appreciate. But anyway, that was an example of, whether I have a good relationship with someone or not, that's really irrelevant to me. Like if I'm involved in this academic discussion, because my purpose and my value is that I want to try to figure out what's true. And if someone doesn't want to have they don't like the relationship that we have because of me doing that, then I just sort of say, well, sorry about that, but this is the way that it is. Where she was saying that, I shouldn't really be doing this kind of truth-seeking exercise, or this was a problem and so on. But I couldn't really pin her down on her view of truth, or the relationship between the truth and building relationships. This was and I think, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that. Like, when you watch that, you say, Francis, you should really be, going at it another, like, instead of head on, right? That, and Anthony's really good at that. Anthony Magnabosco. You have this kind of where you're not, and then he goes around and has another example that then sheds light to kind of get people out of that deadlock, and to get them to think about something else, which is like a parallel thing that has comparative kinds of circumstances, that if they just thought about something that was not this particular thing, but something that had some parallel, and then get them to think about that, then they could apply that back to this kind of deadlock that exists.
I'd probably have to rewatch it to really give my full insights, but just kind of off memory, I think I would have been like, so you have this, you really value these relationships. These relationships sound really important to you. I value truth, and if it was truthful, you'd say you also value relationships, because you probably do, I would imagine. And
like, it's more of a personal. So in an academic setting, I don't like I don't want to have bad, like, I'm not trying to create, but I fully expect by what I do to result in a souring of certain relationships. Like, I'm expecting that, and I'm sacrificing that, because I think that this is not, if you concern yourself about relationships in a truth-seeking kind of mode, then you're gonna maybe pull back and not be as aggressive in your trying to get at what's going on.
It's still on the priority list, but probably lower than truth.
Much lower. Yeah.
So you'd state, she prioritizes, you prioritize her. Speaking to her, you prioritize, relationships. I prioritize truth. I still, value relationships, but it's lower on my priority list. I'm wondering, like, why are these two value sets incompatible? What's causing them to not be able to connect? And I think our answer would hopefully shed some light onto, why she's holding on to that value so strongly. Otherwise, you can ask directly, like, you really value these relationships. And it seems like truth might be, lower down on your priority list. Why is that the case? Why do you prioritize relationships over the truth? And that could shed some light on the situation too. I mean, maybe these relationships are important to her because of, some past trauma. I mean, obviously I don't want to diagnose anyone, but it might shed some light onto what's really going on underneath, And then I think that's helpful to go through that process. And if she might not really know what's underlying that until she thinks about it, until she, looks into herself, if you will.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, I think just thinking about it now, and this was very apparent, and this is quite a common thing that happens in these discussions about Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations, is that the non-Indigenous people who see themselves as what's called settlers, so that's how they identify, which I would never, that's not something I think is a helpful way of, like, it's a political stance. But when you do identify as a settler, you willingly give up all claims to criticize or critique the non-settler. Like, it's like your position is illegitimate. So you're a settler, you're there you're there by the goodwill of the Indigenous, and you just should be agreeing with them, and certainly not disagreeing, because your position is illegitimate. Like that, and that's I think that if I were to diagnose what was going on in her mind, and she did say this quite a few times, that my ancestors have benefited from doing these terrible things to Indigenous people, so now my role is to not really be critical of these views that I'm hearing. I should be accepting of these views, and I'm not even going to question them. Like, I'm not even getting to the point of examining, whatever's making someone, an Indigenous person, believe these things. I just think that I'm a good settler if I just defer to them. I defer to them in all things, because it's not my place to have this critical position. So I think that's relatively accurate.
If I were to take a guess, it sounds like she's trying to achieve fairness through lack of critique of the Indigenous people or policies, and like that's my kind of like a leveling thing, maybe. I mean, obviously, I don't know for sure, but it sounds like that, and that's what I would dig into. I'd ask, hey, is this what's going on? Is this a good strategy to do that? Direction I would go.
And things like, could you think of some examples where, this could have some pitfalls, and then not necessarily saying it that bluntly, right? But saying, what would happen if this occurred, like there's been, actual things occurring, like, the anger that was created by so there in May 2021, and this is this big issue that I've been involved in for 3.5 years. It was announced that the remains of 215 children have been found at this residential school. It turned out that was not true, that it was anomalies on a GPR machine, and that's not confirmation of remains. That's just anomalies that could be a variety of different soil disturbances, which can only really be determined through excavation. And as a result of this announcement, dozens of churches were burned to the ground or vandalized. And many of those churches were Indigenous churches, and very, very upsetting to the Indigenous populations who were going to these churches. They were there. They lost their major kind of gathering place, and the nature of the building and so on, that had comfort and so on. So that is an example of just deferring to Indigenous people, like this view, which was kind of that's what she was she was kind of annoyed that I was trying to draw attention to the lack of evidence that was being deployed to make this claim. But, that scenario, which is these negative consequences from the false claim, could potentially shed some light on how just deferring to a particular view could perhaps result in the destruction of relationships. So, does she think that this kind of way of approaching things always results in better relationships, and what is it about that results in these kinds of things, which I'm that's where I'm sort of at quite a superficial level now at what I'm dealing with the Spectrum Street Epistemology,
Mm-hmm.
because you have to do it a lot to kind of realize like some kinds of steps that you can go through to uncover more of the reasons why people believe the things that they do.
Yeah, I think that's. I was going to ask you about if there are any shortcomings to Spectrum Street Epistemology, and I think that one's kind of on my list. That it often does stay on kind of superficial level sometimes. It doesn't get down to those deep layers. Do you think getting down to those deep layers is something that's important or beneficial?
Definitely. Like I think that's the mother lode, if you're able to do that, And I haven't really had an aha moment yet where I think, wow, I really did. I one of the things in the critique of my trans activism exploration was these two people who were very accomplished, appeared to be very accomplished street epistemologists. They said one thing which I hadn't thought of, which I now try to deploy as much as I can, which is, could you give me an example of that? So if someone's making some statement which is a little bit difficult to understand as to what they're talking about, give it. So trying to make it a little bit more concrete, and then you can, once you get that example, and it does make the person think, like if they have to apply what they're talking about, it makes them think more deeply about what they actually mean. So that was and I did deploy that a few times. The next time I was doing it to what I thought was very, very beneficial kinds of, because that's what I'm not sure if you find this. I get really tired doing it. Do you get tired?
No, not so much. I stay pretty excited, and
I get very mentally tired because I'm trying to keep track of all the different claims and what I could be doing and so on. So if I go beyond about an hour, I start to get really tired, and then things kind of deteriorate at that point. But it's kind of hard. That's another thing, is sort of knowing when you've done enough. Like,
yeah. I'm out there for sometimes 5-6 hours. So
yeah, I can do about an hour, and then I want to kind of stop and then regroup and think through what happened there and how things can be improved. That's sort of what I do most of the time. But yeah, but in that case, that could you just provide an example of that? That was really helpful to trying to figure out what this person's position was, because oftentimes you have these terms that are not very clear, and it's not really, you can sort of say, oh, I sort of understand that, but I don't exactly understand that, this kind of thing.
And they might mean something different than how your interpretation of those words meant, and you end up talking past each other. I've done that plenty of times.
Yeah.
What we talked about this briefly earlier, but I want to kind of bring it back up again. Like with that one female student, I think she was a student.
Yeah, she was.
You kind of said that you were like telling her your position. She was telling you her position. I'm wondering, like I in the SE course we refer to that as like messaging, and it's I think in the course it says to not state your position unless you're asked.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm kind of on the fence about that. I think it's situational, in my opinion. I think that sometimes that's the best approach. Like, it might avoid a debate. It might turn into a debate if you disclose your position. Sometimes people grab onto that and they just want to attack that position. I'm sure you're aware of that.
Yeah.
And then other times, I think if you're talking with someone and you don't necessarily disclose your position and you're asking all these very deep, inquiring questions about their position, it invokes a certain level of suspicion. Like, what is this person trying to get at? Are they trying to
Yeah.
change my
Yeah.
mind? Or, you know,
Mm-hmm.
so I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm kind of in favor of the latter. Like, first of all, it's impossible for me because everyone sort of
Yeah.
knows my positions, so I don't have really the. And I think, like, I think that it's important to recognize that, objectivity is the goal. So that, and this is what a mistake I often hear people saying is that, you believe in the, absolute objectivity, and that, but I don't think it's possible, as I said, because to be completely objective, because you're things that don't make sense to you, you're going to question more than things that do make sense to you. That's just inevitable. So obviously it's going to be the conversation is going to be colored by that. What you have is the ideal of objectivity. Like, I would hate to be trying to manipulate things to have a particular outcome. Like that is definitely not something that I'm trying to do. And I've worked very, very hard to not, be involved in conversations to the extent that I want to, structure the outcome in some kind of way. These things are really, it's as much a benefit for me to try to figure out why this person believes the things that they do, as it is for them to try to figure out why they believe the things that they do. So I don't think I'm going to, I would argue that it's just a more honest conversation. And as long as you're not being manipulative, I don't really see that there's a problem with it. Like, I don't like, everyone should realize that everyone has their own views. Like, everyone has their own views on these matters, but you should be able to change your mind if you're given the evidence to do so. Like, that should be the kind of the ideal, I guess. And I think it's true. It is suspicion. It is suspicious if, like, anyway, I don't, I think, I guess there's, diversity of tactics. It might work. Depends on your personality, I guess. I'm quite a strident individual. Normally. Like, I do this because I think it's important to model this kind of inquiring process in the current state that we're in, which is we've lost our capacity to be able to listen to views which differ from our own. That's not happening at all. And so this is a way of enabling this to occur, however imperfectly. And you're mentioning about the superficiality. A friend of mine, Robin Collins, because he watches a lot of this as well, and he said that, he finds that it almost makes it seem like all ideas are equal. That is a one possible outcome, which is not that technically shouldn't be what happens if you have a skilled facilitator, because the skilled facilitator should be able to expose through questioning, like Socrates in Plato's Republic. Like, that's just the whole process there, is that it's not that Socrates thought that all ideas were equally valid. He just would, through a process of questioning, gradually reveal to everyone that this was the more this view had more evidentiary basis and logical character than other views. So, but if you don't have a facilitator who's able to do that, then it seems like all ideas are equally valid, because nothing really becomes apparent as to why. And as well, if you don't have expertise in a particular area, like something like the vaccines, for example, is a good example of this. Like, I don't know, I know nothing about these vaccines, and I have no ability to evaluate any of these claims. I'm reliant upon expertise of people, and also, there's people who I respect their judgment, and then they've gone and they've dug into a bunch of these things themselves. So I kind of have a neutral position on it now, because I know people on. I know that there's all sorts of perspectives from all sorts of people who I don't think that they're irrational, and I don't think they're tinfoil hat people or anything like that. I respect their judgment on a number of things, and they all have very, very different views. And there's a lot of people who are skeptical about the sort of scientific research that's being done on these things. But I know that there's complaint for people who thinks that there's very good evidence for the vaccines being effective, are annoyed at street epistemology sessions where you have it appears that there's not really any clear valid position on this, based upon a whole bunch of people just getting confused. Like if you don't have expertise in a subject, you don't have any.
Going from a strong position to a less strong position. Like, you're going from a higher confidence typically to a lower confidence. You're never going from a lower confidence to a higher confidence.
Because you need to have, have something to point out, like whatever the studies are on the vaccines and how they've, lessened the severity of the symptoms or something. Like, I don't know anything about that. So I wouldn't be able to point out some kind of, factual thing. Whereas when I was doing the thing on, that was my latest one at Mount Royal University on universities should foster respect for Indigenous ways of knowing. That was the claim, which is the opposite to what I believe. And I'm a person who studies this area, so I'm familiar with all the various things. And for me, that was a lot easier a session, because I could think of, like, if you heard this, which I knew, like, this is for example, there, with respect to the graves, the unmarked, the claims about the 215 children being buried, excavations required to make that determination. Some people say they're not. And then, so therefore, what evidence is it possible that there could be other evidence besides excavations that would show this? And I knew that there were two eyewitness accounts of the burials, right? So so if you heard that there were eyewitness accounts, would that make you more agreeable to the position that the remains of 215 children have been found, or remains of children generally? And it's like, well, it would depend on whether their degree of reliability of these, these sorts of things. But still, because I was aware of this case in quite a lot of detail, it made me a much better facilitator, because I could think of possibilities of what could result in people possibly changing their level of confidence. Whereas at the vaccines, I could think of maybe it'd have to be kind of hypothetical things that I would be thinking about. I wouldn't really know the kinds of questions to ask. Anyway, so that was his criticism, was it just seems a lot of the time that there's no more valid or less valid, that all things are kind of equally valid. And that's not the objective at all of this. Like if it's done properly, because the evidence should, the view that has the most evidence is the one that's the most valid.
Yeah.
From a factual standpoint. That's why I'm more comfortable with the factual kinds of arguments than the value arguments, because
Sure.
but I think the value I think that there are ways of determining if values have more validity to them than other values. But it's kind of a slightly mentally confusing area for me that I haven't figured out very well.
Yeah, how I like to view at it, whether it's going to be like this very factual conversation or this value conversation, is I kind of let my conversation partner figure that out. I just kind of pick up on the cues. If I asked them, why do you think that X is true? And they, say, provide this evidence or another claim, then it's off to races factually. If they tell me something that sometimes they directly state a value, and that's great, and then I know. But sometimes they'll make a statement and I'll be like, that really sounds like a value. Then I'll confirm, say, hey, is this what you said? You really want these people to have freedom, blah, 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 right? And that's my route. I mean, I don't know. I like it. I think it's... I think I'd like to meet people where they're at, right? And then it gives them the opportunity to reevaluate. And maybe they'll go from a value reason to a factual reason, or probably not the opposite way. But yeah. I think it's important to talk to people about, their real reason rather than trying to force something else in that spot.
Yeah. And that's another interesting thing, which Anthony is very good at uncovering, which is when people, it's not the real reason why they believe things.
Yep.
And trying to
check.
And try to, and that's something that I've not really been very accomplished at being able to get at.
Yeah, it's pretty simple actually. It's just a matter of you can have it be as simple as if this wasn't the case, if you never learned this, would you still believe X claim to be true? And if they say yes, then that's probably not the real reason. If they say no, then that's probably the real reason.
Yeah. Yeah, I know, because I did some things there, and this is the kind of thing that I like. See, I find these political issues that are highly contentious, and then I want to go and amongst the people and kind of get them talking about it a bit. I think that's kind of because there's a lot of problems now with people being able to discuss these contentious areas, and to have it so that it doesn't become more fraught after you leave. Anyway, so in the best example of this that I'm still involved with a little to some extent is these name changes that are being proposed in various areas. So there's a town called Powell River, and the Indigenous group wants to change its name from Powell River to something else because they claim that it's named after this guy by the name of Powell, who was a Indian superintendent, and he did these things they considered to had negative impacts on the Indigenous population. Anyway, it turns out it's highly unlikely that the town was named after Powell, the superintendent. It was named after another Powell. Anyway, the townspeople are all agitated about this because they're trying to push through this change. They're pretending that it's a democratic process, but really it's almost like the decision has already been made and they're just doing these consultation exercises. So people generally don't want to change the name, most people, because it's what they're used to and there's no reason to change it. So you're going to have all this upheaval and disruption for no reason, and so on. So, but
Yeah. Okay.
often what happens is that the money, how much it's going to cost, is a reason that's given. So in that case, it says, well, let's say that it wasn't going to cost anything, because like, there's going to be no cost to changing the name. Would you still would you be okay with changing the name? And almost
There
all
it
the
is.
time, almost all the time, no. So it's really not a cost issue that it's about. It's about, this has got some, they've got some affinity towards it. There's some kind of history. Not that they really thought one way or the other. It's just like, it's kind of part of the way they think about themselves and so on. And it's
Part of
going to
their
be,
identity.
yeah. Just more, it's how I've always thought of this place. And now it's going to be called some strange name that it means nothing to me. And it's going to be very alienating for that to happen.
I think that's a really great observation or breakdown of what people are saying. I think that's really great. I think you've probably came to the correct conclusion of how the majority of those people are viewing that. It sounds about right to me.
Yeah, well, it certainly is. That seemed to be what I was hearing at the time. Now, in terms of the numbers, it's hard to know, like, the whole thing has been so manipulated by the politicians that we don't have a good, like, nothing has been done systematically. Like, they should just have a scientific polling firm go in there and do a scientific poll of the area, because then we will at least have some factual basis for understanding. But they don't want to do that because they want to pretend like most people want to change the name, like they're still, and it's not, it's by no means clear. It seems by what is apparent from what's the unscientific surveys that have been done, that the majority are opposed to it. But unless there's a scientific survey done, we within a certain margin of error. But no one's attempted to do a scientific survey.
Gotcha. All right, I think I've hit everything that I wanted to ask you. Do you have any questions for me or anything that you want to bring up?
Well, I'm interested in your own. So how long have you been doing the street epistemology for?
I think I learned what street epistemology was in 2019. I started doing some stuff, I think it was right towards the end of the year in 2019, just doing it online, and I did it online for like 2 years, sometimes posting videos on my channel. And then a couple of years ago, I started doing it in person on college campuses mostly. And yeah, that was a really good experience. I've had, I don't even know how many talks. I mean, dozens and dozens and dozens. And it's been a great experience, and I really enjoy doing it. I think I liked what you said earlier about, you said that the goal is to not only have your conversation partner potentially learn something, that you're also out there trying to learn their perspective, and you can learn just as much as they can. And I really take that to heart. That's really something that I try to do.
So what is the most surprising thing that you've learned?
Oh, that's a good question. It's a really good question. I think it might be that a lot of both religious and political claims are often tightly wound around values. A lot of times they're not necessarily dependent on something factual.
Yeah.
Sometimes things are, obviously, but not always.
Yeah. No, it's. I find it fascinating. I'm very, very encouraged by the ability to open up discussion. Like this seems to be one of the most important methods now for doing that, because of the terrible climate that exists. And I'm hoping that when people see people, like I just have done a few where, what I do is I take a couple of people with me so that I don't, like, I don't do these cold calling kinds of things that you do. I'm too nervous about that. So what I do is I bring people with me who then and I'm curious, I'm just trying to figure out the method myself. And then I hope that people will sort of watch and will want to. And it's happened a few times where we've gotten other people, but I'm hoping once it becomes more well known that, people might show up and want to do it and so on. But do you find people you just kind of sit at a table, right? That's how you do it?
I not always a table, but a lot of times, yeah, I'll just sit on by a busy walkway and just have a sign and just let people approach me. Yeah, and people do. Sometimes it takes like 20 minutes, but sometimes it's like people will actually form a line to talk to me, and
Okay.
I'm just amazed by that. Like the first time that happened, I was like, wow, there's really a line forming here. This is crazy.
Yeah, well, the sign, I don't have a sign, so I
Might
should get a
help.
sign. What does your sign say?
It's a whiteboard, so I'll change it out. It's almost always something slightly different. I've done like, what do you believe and why? I've done what is the most important to you? I've done, if there's one thing you could change about the world, what would it be? So I have all types of different stuff.
Okay, I'm gonna have to get the sign.
It helps. A sign helps.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's something I haven't done. Just showing up, because I that makes me nervous just thinking about it. Because it's like, what happens if no one sit there and wait for?
I actually just posted a video. Yes, I think it was yesterday, and I actually tried it on a private college, and I actually was there for quite a few hours before a security guard finally approached me and was like, "Hey, do you have permission to be here?" No, and then he asked me to leave really politely, but
But you can't just go on to into a building, into a like a you can't just go into a student center or whatever, or student building. And
I was actually outside, but no, apparently I can't on a private campus. If it
oh,
was
it's
a public
private.
campus, yeah, private,
If it's
yeah.
public, you can do it.
Public, they would never even talk to me. So yeah.
That's interesting. It's because I that's a big battle that I'm well. See, in Canada, we have provincial jurisdictions, and in Alberta, which is a province that I'm in, and Saskatchewan, which is the province one over to the east, the court decisions are very favorable to just showing up on campus, and the university not being able to restrict you when your purpose is freedom of expression. But in all the other provinces, the court decisions are not as favorable. And
Mm.
so you can actually be asked to leave the campus if they don't want you there. Like they can whatever, for whatever reason they're going to say. And so then and I was testing this out in Ontario, which doesn't have very favorable court decisions. And I was talking to my lawyer about this, because if in Alberta and that's what happened in Saskatchewan. So they strongly suggested that I not come to campus. And I just ignored it. And then they obviously had their lawyers talk about this. And they said, well, we can't stop her from doing it because we got into this big, huge court case before and we lost this court case. So we can't do that. So they basically almost welcomed me on campus when I showed up there. So they were just trying to, discourage me. But in Ontario, it's not the same. So I was talking to my lawyer saying, well, what's going to happen? And he says, well, they could just come and serve you with a trespass notice. And I said, well, what happens if I don't leave, if I just whatever? He said, well, you can be arrested. And I said, well, this would be good. If I'm arrested, then I can use that as a forum to talk about how, universities are not, like, they're working very, very hard to prevent these ideas from being discussed, and this is having this negative effect on our ability to pursue the truth and do all these things, which, until 10 years ago, it was kind of taken for granted as the purpose of the university. So that's kind of an interest. But these are all public. These are all public institutions, not private institutions. Sure. And therefore, the charter, you can make the argument about the Charter of Rights in public. It's in public institutions that it applies.
Sure.
Anyway, Pierce, well, I think we have, certainly gone into a lot of different details.
Yeah, this was fun.
I think that people should. I find your style to be very casual, and sort of people feel a sense of comfort. I'm more. I've got a more kind of in your face kind of
right.
But still, it's kind of interesting to watch people's different ways in which they, try to engage people and get them to think about their assumptions.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah, it's been, excuse me, it's been a really lovely conversation. I can't thank you enough for coming on here and live streaming with me. For anybody who's watching, there is a link to our channel in the description, so you can go out there, check that out. And yeah, any final words before I end the stream and play the outro?
Open and honest discussion is always better than the alternative.
Agreed. All right. I guess I'll say take care, Francis, and everybody in the audience. I'll see you later.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.